It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Friday, December 13th, 2024. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In the biggest little city in the world, Reno, Nevada, I'm John Ramey. We have a repeat of the four biggest stories from last week. They're still gurgling. We've got an update on the protests in Georgia, and a former Manchester City striker is set to become the far-right president of the nation of Georgia. We have an update on the new French prime minister, the fourth of the year, Sacre Bleu. We will check in with the South Korean impeachment vote. And, of course, Syria. Assad has fallen, and now Israel's piling on. There's a lot to get to. Hi, Sam.
Hi, John.
Let us begin in Georgia. Let's go with Voice of America, Dateline Tbilisi. Georgia's political crisis deepened Friday today after new pro-Europe protests were announced ahead of the controversial nomination of a far-right government loyalist as president. The Black Sea nation has been in turmoil since the governing Georgian Dream Party claimed a victory in a contested October parliamentary election. Its decision last month to delay EU session talks, igniting this wave of mass rallies. So, the Electoral College in Georgia is dominated by officials loyal to the Georgian Dream Party, and Mikhail
Kavelashvili.
Mikhail Kavelashvili, again, a former striker in the English Premier League for Manchester City, is the sole candidate. The incumbent president, Salome Zurabishvili, is an independent politician. This is reporting from CBS News, and she has been, of course, among the most vocal critics of Georgian Dream. She has called out election interference, calling the most recent vote a total fraud. And Reuters news agency, two international polling groups agree with that assessment. Those two international polling groups from the U.S. agree with that assessment, along with Reuters. The results of that election were statistically impossible. Now, last week, Sam, President Zurabishvili, the incumbent, the independent, was essentially declaring she would stay in power beyond her term, which is technically illegal, to prevent the installation of Kavelashvili.
Or whoever at the time was going to be the president.
Yeah,
now we know who it is.
Right. To be essentially appointed by this totally partisan electoral college that is apparently nowhere near where the political will of the Georgian people are, or is.
Seemingly not. And as far as I know, she still has not agreed to step aside. So we're going to have to follow this story in future weeks. But it just seems to be a naked and very sort of intentionally naked power grab, right? Just to say to the pro-European Union protesters, there's nothing you can do. Right, we're going to stitch up everything. So you might as well just shut up and go home. At least that's the way it appears to me. They might have sort of read the room and said, okay, you know what? We'll give you the presidency because it's a European-style non-executive office anyway, right? So we'll let you preserve some voice inside the government. Instead, it really seems, again, intentional for them to say, just forget about it. We're going to take everything, and there's nothing you can do. So we'll have to see in future weeks if Burashvili decides to step aside or not. I think at some point she might decide that it's just forced her hand. Well, and hopefully no military or other kind of force will be deployed to oust her. But that's certainly a possibility.
Just looking at some of the numbers, over 100 people have been hospitalized with injuries during these protests. More than 400 people have been arrested. And of course, Georgian Dream, which is the party that has claimed victory in this disputed election, is backed by an oligarch, and they are essentially turning Georgia pro-Russian. They are locking down the government with Russian stooges, and that's what the people are protesting, because political will in Georgia had that country prior to this election, prior to the ascension of or rather prior to a reversal of Georgian Dream policy, I believe, Georgia had been on a path to join the EU.
That's right. Yes. And it really was, there were protests after the elections, but it was really the decision of Georgia Dream to delay the
Yeah.
accession talks to the European Union that touched off the massive street protests, which are still ongoing.
Reporting from the Hill, President Biden readying visa restrictions on officials from Georgia amid a government crackdown on mass protests. So there could be some U.S. response to how Georgian officials are dealing with the protests.
I mean, I would be in favor
Not a
of that,
particularly democratic manner.
I don't think it will make that much difference. I don't think any of these people are planning to go to Disneyland anytime soon.
All right. Again, 100 hospitalized and 400 or so arrested.
Yes.
With these protests that have been going on for the better part of 2 weeks now.
Yes.
To France. New York Times reporting French President Emmanuel Macron on Friday tapped Francois Bayrou, a veteran centrist politician and one of Macron's top allies, as the new prime minister. A move that few expect would stabilize France's roiling politics. Sam, my middle name is Lafayette. I don't speak a lick of French. I believe it is Francois Bayrou is how I pronounce that. Bayrou. Okay. Yeah. Mr. Bayrou becomes the country's fourth prime minister this year, an ominous record. Again, the Times reporting the task ahead is immense. He must now form a cabinet capable of shepherding bills through a fractured, cantankerous lower house of parliament that ousted his predecessor, that is Michel Barnier, last week. Tough times.
Yes, this just broke today. We'll have to see how it works out. Bayrou has his work cut out for him. He's got to submit a budget by the end of the month. That is the end of the year. And I'm sure he will. But if it's voted down, then pretty much all bets are off. And France might have to have another snap election, which sadly will probably not take place during our Electorama 2024 Festival of Democracy, as they say in Indonesia. But we might sort of include it as a bonus track. So again, Bayrou is just moving into his office and setting up, the curtains and things like this. So we'll have to see how this unfolds in future weeks. He is, I should say, though, he was sort of Macron before Macron. He was the leader of or at least one of the top officials of a centrist party that sat in the middle of the French ideological spectrum between the socialists and what was then the UMP and is now Les Républicains. This was 20 years ago. And it was really when Macron became president in 2017, this was sort of the fulfillment of Bayrou's original vision of a strong centrist party to govern the nation. So in a way, it's kind of, depending on how this works out, this could be a sad coda to French centrism, and it would be really kind of sadly ironic for him to be the one that might preside over the demise of French centrism.
The French government is the Fifth Republic, which dates to 1968. I have that right?
I think it might be a little earlier, but somewhere in the 60s,
okay.
Yes.
End of de Gaulle.
Yes.
Is this the craziest thing that's happened during the Fifth Republic? Like this is pretty, France has its tumultuous times and they form new republics, right? But this go around, is this as fractious as it's been?
I can't, and certainly in the time that I've been keeping track of it in my adult life, it's the worst that I can remember. But I think that in the beginning of the Fifth Republic, the Fifth Republic was launched because things were already very bad, and they didn't get better right away in the beginning. So since the beginning of the Fifth Republic, I think it probably is. Yes, I think that's probably
certainly true. The most tumultuous time of the 21st century for France.
Oh, yeah, easily. Yes. Yeah. No question.
Anything to add, or shall we move to South Korea?
I think we should move to South Korea. We're going to want to spend the bulk of our time on Syria, which is really the big story this week, obviously. So let's move on to South Korea first.
Okay. Dateline Seoul, Reuters reporting a defiant South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol faces a second impeachment vote on Saturday, that is tomorrow, over his short-lived attempt to impose martial law, a move that shocked the country, split his party, and imperiled his presidency halfway through his term. Okay, we covered this last week. Yoon tried to impose military rule, martial law, on the 3rd of December. That was rescinded 6 hours later after Parliament defied troops and police to vote against the decree, and it plunged the country into a constitutional crisis and triggered widespread calls for the president to step down for breaking the law. Yoon's conservative People Power Party, the PPP, boycotted the first impeachment vote a week ago, preventing a quorum. But since then, PPP leader Han Dong-hoon has urged party members to vote for impeachment on Saturday, which is probably like right now in Korea.
Yeah, they're probably
it's already Saturday there.
They're probably starting the proceedings in the National Assembly right now.
Right. At least 7 PPP members have said they would vote to impeach. That's Yoon's own party. So yes. 7 have said they will vote to impeach him. One of them was quoted as saying he would vote for impeachment for the sake of swift stabilization of the people's livelihood, economy, and diplomacy. The PPP floor leader said on Friday, however, that the party stance is still to oppose impeachment. So it's getting spicier.
Yeah, well, one thing I found interesting is that in South Korea, you can have repeated impeachment votes, which we don't do here, right? I mean, here you get one vote, and if it doesn't work, it's over. The main opposition party, the Democratic Party in South Korea, or the I think it's called the DPK, has vowed that they will just keep holding votes until it works. And so, good for them, one thing. But the other thing is that if 7 PPP members say that they will vote for impeachment, they only need one more. And so that's really on a knife edge. And the way this is all played out is just, I mean, it's a crazy story to me. Because before last Saturday's impeachment vote, literally as it was getting started, President Yoon gave a televised address to the nation in which he apologized for having declared martial law. My bad
on the martial law.
And promised not to do it again. And so
fool me once.
Apparently that was enough. Right? He also said that he would throw himself on the mercy of his party to decide, what sort of measures would be taken against him instead of having to face actual removal from office via impeachment. And this seemed to be enough for his party to boycott the proceedings, as you mentioned.
But however, it's eroded over the last week.
Well, that was not good enough for the opposition parties. And by the way, as many as 50,000 people are out in various parts of Seoul demonstrating to demand the ouster of President Yoon, who has approval ratings right now in the low 10 to 20%. Right? I mean, everybody wants him gone except the members of his own party in the National Assembly. And so the police tried to raid his office looking for evidence, and only a handful of files were turned over. They also tried to search. They were stopped by the members of the Presidential Guard, and so there is a real power struggle playing out in numerous dimensions in South Korea. They tried to raid his office, and protesters have tried to actually break into the presidential residence. So this is a very heated situation. And so
a precarious constitutional crisis.
Yes. And so yesterday, President Yoon, knowing that there was another impeachment vote coming up, gave another address to the nation in which he totally backtracked. And as was it the New York Times that you quoted? That was the defiant President Yoon, who basically refused to leave power and said and reiterated many.
Sorry, that was Reuters.
I'm sorry. Okay, yeah. Fine. He reiterated many of the same points he made in his original declaration of martial law, i.e., that he was doing so to protect the nation from essentially the enemy within, right? Anti-state, pro-North Korean operators inside of South Korea, which is just
Sam.
It's ludicrous.
What's this fifth column in South Korea?
Okay, now
come on.
Just to be fair, the main opposition party, the DPK, has traditionally been the party that advocates closer relations with North Korea. But they're not really doing that now. As you may recall, when the last DPK president, Moon Jae-in, met with Kim Jong-un at the DMZ under the auspices, by the way, of the first Donald Trump presidency. This was a historic moment, but it ended up being nothing. Since then, by the way, North Korea has only ramped up its rhetoric against the South, which traditionally has operated under something like the one China policy, in which the Koreans are one people, tragically divided by historical circumstances beyond their control, and someday,
i.e., a war that's 80 years old and still hasn't officially ended.
70, but yes,
sure. Sorry, 70. Yeah,
and so at some point they'll be reunited by means that we aren't going to actually mention in any detail. This is the way the North has traditionally talked about the South. This year, that's off. Okay, now they routinely refer in North Korean state media to the South as a hostile foreign nation. All right. So the idea that the DPK is trying to make peace with the North now, that's just not happening. All right. It's entirely ridiculous. And so Yoon has decided that, I guess he figured that, well, I tried to be nice about it and people still don't like me, so I'll just go back to what I was doing before. Now, I'm really hoping that tomorrow's impeachment vote will succeed, but I'm reasonably confident that a future one will, even if it doesn't succeed tomorrow.
Any other thoughts on the South Korean constitutional crisis?
Not right now. I mean, we could go on about this. Is an enormous story all by itself, but it's still unresolved. So I'm sure that there are other elements of it that we can get to in future episodes.
I mean, to be honest, all four of these stories are kind of huge stories.
They're amazing. Yeah. I mean,
and they're all happening at the same time.
At the same time.
Over Christmas, no less.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Washington Post reporting as we turn to Syria. Dateline Damascus. Thousands of worshipers crammed into the marble esplanade of the Umayyad Mosque in Syria's capital for the first Friday prayers since the ouster of President Bashar al-Assad. The country's newly installed caretaker prime minister addressed the crowd, heralding a new dawn, but acknowledging challenges ahead. Speaking to rapturous chanting, Mohammed al-Bashir praised the victory by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Islamist rebel group that seized power just a week ago, ending Assad's 24-year rule. And this is my note, and the Assad dynasty, which was 50 years of brutal, repressive, sadistic dictatorship. The WAPO is also reporting UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called Friday today for, quote, an inclusive political process and, quote, a smooth transition of power in Syria. I mean, that's ludicrous. I understand what General Guterres is attempting to say, but there is
he
no
has to say that. What do you expect him to say?
It's not going to be smooth, Secretary General. Yeah. And he called Israel's airstrikes across Syria in recent days extensive violations of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Israel has said that its attacks were designed to prevent weapons from ending up in the wrong hands. Now, remember, there are chemical weapons in Syria that Assad used against his own people.
That's right.
Defense Minister Israel Katz said Friday that the Israeli military would be deployed on Mount Hermon, that straddles the Lebanon-Syria border north of the Golan Heights, throughout the winter. Over the weekend, Israeli troops took control of the strategic mountain peak, which offers armies a significant vantage point after Syrian forces fled.
Yes, it is the highest mountain in the region.
Elsewhere, Russia is dismantling equipment at an airbase in Syria and loading it into cargo planes after Bashar al-Assad has fallen. Images captured Friday, today, display. These images captured by Maxar. You familiar with Maxar, Sam? They're like
slightly, yes.
Satellite photography defense entity. Showed cargo planes on an airfield, a Russian airfield, taking in equipment, basically. So they've got the naval base and an air base on the Mediterranean coast in Syria, and basically the Russians are packing up.
Yes, that's right. I mean, this is an enormous story. And when last we left it last week, Damascus had yet to fall. They fell the next day. And apparently, because the Syrian military just melted away and disappeared. And I read a lengthy story on
Throwing
Reuters.
away their uniforms and
Yes,
melting into the countryside.
exactly. Read a lengthy story on Reuters today that said that not only was the Syrian government of al-Assad dependent on Russia and Iran for military support, but that essentially they'd handed over operational command to Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And
Interesting.
so, yes, and so this further eroded the Syrian military over a period of more than a decade, as we know. Now, I think it made sense at the time because after a while, it's difficult to get your troops to continue attacking their own people. So if it's Iranians and Lebanese Hezbollah actually calling the shots, then they don't care as much about the fate of Syrian civilians, right? You don't want to ask some kid to go and drop bombs on his own hometown, right? If you're his Syrian commander, and so meanwhile, the Syrian economy collapsed over the period, over a very long period of time, so that the army couldn't even be paid, or not as much, at least, to keep track with inflation, which is much, much higher in Syria than in any other part of the world, even going back a decade because of the war. And so morale among the military just collapsed. So once Hezbollah became decimated in Lebanon and could no longer replenish their forces in Syria and basically petered out there, the Syrian military, especially the rank and file, were like, what are we doing? Right? I mean, this is basically over, and they disappeared. Now, the problem is we don't know where they are. But one of the biggest things about this, I would say, is that right now, and for a long time, there are lots of people who hate Hamas. But this week, I don't think anybody hates them more than Bashar al-Assad. Because if Hamas had not attacked Israel in their atrocities of October 7th of last year, then Israel would probably not have escalated their war into Lebanon, pretty much wiping out Hezbollah and ending their ability to reinforce Syria. And I think Assad will probably still be in power. And so I think also Iran.
No matter what happens in Ukraine or with the Russians.
That's right. I think that the larger factor was certainly Hezbollah,
Yeah.
because the Russians were really only providing air power. It was Hezbollah that had taken over operational command and was providing a lot of the fighting forces.
All right. Our colleague, Tim Miller at the Bulwark, has floated a theory this week that because of continued support of Ukraine and continued support of Israel, American adversaries in Russia and Iran and Syria have been weakened. And he points out that nobody seems to be taking a victory lap for this apparent victory for American foreign policy. Are you buying that?
I think that it's overstated and perhaps a little premature, right? I I don't think Russia has actually been all that weakened. Iran certainly has been.
Russia's lost hundreds of thousands of men
Okay,
against
but
Ukraine.
I understand that, but they're still winning that war, and it's possible that things will go badly for them economically in the coming year. But that's a much larger issue than we have time to discuss today,
Sure.
right? Syria is not as important to them as Ukraine. Now, one thing that I've heard a couple of people say this week that I found really interesting is that losing their air base in Syria will make it much harder for Russia to keep supplying their mercenary forces, the Africa Corps, that operate in
The
Mali.
subtly titled.
Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger and the Central African Republic, right? Because that was an important refueling depot for the resupply of those efforts. Now, I think this is also a little overstated because if you look at a map of the large region, you'll see that Syria isn't that much closer to the African countries than is, say, the southern coast of Russia on the Black Sea. It's a bit farther, right? But I think you could probably still resupply your African forces. It'll be harder, but I don't think that it puts an end to that effort. So I think the real big loser, again, is Iran, who, if anybody might hate Hamas as much as Bashar al-Assad does, it's them. Because the war of Hamas against Israel and vice versa has just knocked back Iran immeasurably, right? They thought of Hezbollah as their main deterrent against Israel. And now that's gone. And if it hadn't been for Hamas, they would probably still have it. And so it's really, it could be an enormous strategic turning point in the region. But I think the reason people aren't taking victory laps is because this is just, a decade after the Arab Spring, which was a long time ago. But things did not turn well in any country that experienced the Arab Spring and its immediate aftermath. Things did not go well for the opposition forces in, or I shouldn't call them forces, but the civilian protesters in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, right? None of these things worked out for any of the people who were trying to institute some more democratic form of governance in any of these countries. So there's a lot of concern that this won't go any better in Syria. Having said that, there are, I think, legitimate reasons why it might be better, if only because the leader of HTS, who until this week was called Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, but has decided to revert to his given name, which is Ahmed al-Sharaa.
He's a kinder, gentler jihadist now, Sam.
That's what he's saying anyway, right? He says he wants to have.
I admire the pluck, frankly.
I do too, but he's saying he wants.
He's distancing himself from his time in Al Qaeda.
Now, okay, he was originally part of a larger organization called Al-Nusra, if I'm not mistaken, right? But he broke with them back in 2016, right? So this is not just something he's saying today. He broke with them quite a number of years ago already. However, the only part of Syria that he's governed thus far is Idlib province. And apparently the HTS governance there was pretty autocratic, right? So it's not like he has any experience actually delivering on, a moderate, inclusive government.
Listen, I'm not ready to call him George Washington.
No. And of course, governing Idlib is a far cry from trying to govern the whole country. But he is making the right noises. And it's possible, at least, that he understands that if only to preserve his own power, it is in his interests not just to say that he isn't a radical jihadist, but to actually not be one. Sure. Right? Because he's seen how things have turned out for actual radical jihadists in the region. Hamas, decimated. Hezbollah, decimated. The Muslim Brotherhood took power in Egypt and was ousted in a military coup. Now, these circumstances in Syria are very different from what they are in any of those other countries. For example, if you look at a map of the region, you will see that Syria shares land borders with 5 nations. Clockwise from the top, it's Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and Lebanon. All 5 of these countries are, to one extent or another, U.S. allies. Each of them is a problematic ally in its own special way, but they all generally have pretty good relations with the U.S. But of all of them, the one that shares the longest border with Syria is, of course, Turkey. And they, pretty much by universal agreement, are the big winner in this exchange thus far.
are we buying the Israeli rationale for inserting themselves into this? I mean, there
Well, it
are
depends.
chemical weapons. Syria is right next door, but
Okay.
again, the UN has said it's a violation of sovereignty. So and we
Oh, it
know.
obviously is. It's
I mean,
entirely
we know
illegal,
what
right?
Israel's been up to of late. So I'm
Yeah,
not gonna.
it's
But
entirely illegal. And
but is it defensible?
I mean, I think that there's a case that to be made that it is, right? They
Yeah,
don't know who's going to take power. There's a
yeah,
lot of weapons there. One of the, they, made no bones about having destroyed Syria's entire navy, which, wasn't exactly a naval
sure,
powerhouse to
right.
begin with, okay? But they did it, right? I think that
Can we say this
people,
is more like Israel destroying Hezbollah than laying waste to Gaza? If we have a
yes, I would
sliding
say it
scale
is.
of like
Because
moral,
they
right?
do seem to have gone almost entirely after military targets. And but it is entirely illegal. We should make sure that we point that
Sure.
out. All right. We either believe in the rules-based international order or we don't. But of course, Israel is going to skate by on this entirely.
I mean,
Uh,
again, it's easy. It is easier for us to talk about the rules-based international order when there are not chemical weapons floating around in a black market next
okay,
door.
I get that.
Yeah.
But
But you're
I
right. You're right. No, we believe in the rules-based order.
But I think the biggest losers in this could end up being the Kurds in the east and northeast of Syria, because Syria is an Arab nation, but the Kurds are not an Arab people, and they've faced discrimination in all the lands in which they live, which we can show on our map here, and this has been a problem for them for centuries, and so we for instance, Turkey, as we were talking about before, uh, does not like the Kurds because they've faced separatist movements from their own Kurdish population. In fact, there are militant separatist movements in pretty much every nation in which the Kurds live. They always have a militant separatist movement, right? It's not all the Kurds, right? But it's a problem for every country in which they live, with the notable exception of Iraq, in which the Kurdish region has always enjoyed a great deal of autonomy ever since the first Gulf War, actually, at the beginning of the 90s. The no
That's
fly
when I
zone,
first heard of the Kurds.
that's right, the no fly zone that the United States instituted after that war enabled the Kurds to form their own semi autonomous region, which has prospered essentially ever since, with, by the way, the help of Turkey. But that doesn't mean Turkey wants another autonomous Kurdish
Sure.
region right next door, which they very much don't. So they've been arming an Arab militia called the Syrian National Army, confusingly, who's been hectoring the Kurds ever since this happened. That is, since Assad fell. And my fear is that there could be a refugee crisis of Kurds moving into Iraq, right? Because that is by far the safest nation for them in the region. Uh, I'm hoping that's not going to work out, but it easily could. I would add also that if I were incoming Secretary of State and erstwhile United States Senator Marco Rubio, I would very soon be saying to President-elect Donald Trump, ISIS came out of
Yes.
eastern Syria and western Iraq because Barack Obama pulled U.S. troops out of Iraq, and it was one of the great foreign policy triumphs of your first term, President Trump, that you wiped out ISIS. Uh, if you let Turkey wipe out the Kurds who are helping us fight ISIS, then ISIS could roar back to life and it'll be on you. But if you can restrain Turkey from going after the Kurds and the Kurds can continue to help us fight ISIS, you won't have to put any troops on the ground and you could help foster a very good outcome in Syria. And you could end up with one of the great peacemaking legacies of any American president in recent history. If I were Rubio, that is exactly what I would be planning to say. Because Rubio, as we know, he's an establishment Republican. And
Sure.
he's especially in the area of foreign policy, which he's just been given charge of. And I think there's actually a pretty good chance that he will do something like this. And I don't know that he won't succeed, actually.
One would hope Rubio is insightful enough to take that approach with President-elect Trump. Here's my question. If Syria does not become reconstituted as a state, as a functioning state soon, is ISIS or something like it fairly likely to fill that vacuum?
I mean, it's certainly possible. I mean,
It's
there's so
possible
many,
enough for us to worry, to root for a functional Syria.
there are so many different ways that this could turn out that it's difficult to say
But
which one it might be,
but
right?
we just want something to work quickly in Syria, correct?
That's right. And so far, for instance, one of the first things that HTS did was institute a nighttime curfew, which, by the way, has since been lifted. They only did this for like 3 or 4 days. But
Kinder, gentler.
yeah, looting was beginning to happen
Yeah.
in Damascus, and they said no. In fact, they imported police officers from Idlib into Damascus just to shore up the vanished Damascus police force. Uh,
Wow.
and this is, they're not screwing around. They've also Al-Shara has said that his men will not be hassling women over what they wear. Right. Having said that, I saw on CNN their reporter Clarissa Ward was, I think, touring the presidential palace of Bashar al-Assad along, which every Western reporter seems to have done.
Looks
this
like a
week.
nice place.
Yeah, much more tasteful than Saddam's palaces, I might
Yeah.
add. But one of the HDS guys asked her to cover her hair, right? So maybe he didn't get the
Right.
memo, right? But I also saw an interview on the PBS NewsHour with a fellow, here I have his name right here. His name was Mohammed Yasser Ghazal. He is the deputy minister of local administration and also now the acting governor of Damascus province, right? He's an HTS guy, but he said there is no HTS anymore. There is only a coalition of forces that are providing the interim government of Syria going forward only till March. They hope to have some political settlement within the next 3 months. That's kind of ambitious, I think.
They're on message.
Yeah, but yeah, again, they're doing a lot of the right things. For instance, when Saddam Hussein was toppled in Iraq, one of the first things that happened was the looting of Baghdad, and American forces stood by and did nothing, right? Which I think was one of the biggest mistakes of the war, and it happened right at the beginning. HTS, again, seems to have learned that specific lesson. Now, this might all be my own wishful thinking, but the point is that I think it's possible, at least, that Ahmed al-Shara and the rest of HTS have looked around the region and seen how things have unfolded for other people in their neighborhood. And they at least have a chance to try and do things better and come up with a better outcome than turned out in any of those other nations. I don't know how high the chances are of that, but I think that al-Shara, anyway, is alive to the dangers of this going badly, because it really seems like he didn't expect to wind up where he is today. It really, from all the reporting I've seen, all they thought they were going to do was take Aleppo to give Erdogan a bargaining chip in his ongoing negotiations with Bashar al-Assad. Basically, Erdogan wanted to send some Syrian refugees back to Syria, and Assad refused to even talk to him. And this was part of the rehabilitation process of Assad into the regional governance, right? He was welcomed into the Arab League after years of being exiled from the League. And people basically thought that he'd won the civil war and he was being rehabilitated. But this whole episode just changed that entirely unexpectedly. No one really thought it was going to turn out this way. And so, again, al-Shara seems to be, he should just be scrambling to try and piece something together. And I think that's what he is doing. But he's doing it with a lot of aplomb. He doesn't seem to be panicked about this at all. And after all, he has been fighting for a good number of years. So I'm sure he's had to deal with many other things that he didn't expect to happen either. So we'll have to see how this works out. There's any number of ways it could all go to hell tomorrow. But for now, we can be very celebratory about the fall of one of the most awful dictators we've seen.
Yeah, the Assads were terrible.
Oh, just awful. I'm sure that everybody's seen on the news the footage of the prison complex, Al Sinai prison, just terrible. But this is going to be unfolding in probably many other unexpected ways for months and years to come. So we'll have to keep a careful eye on it.
Okay, yeah, we'll keep an eye on all four of these stories because we could get developments next week.
Yes. Well, on top of that, next week, for instance, just the other day, we got an inflation report. We got last week a very strong jobs report.
Yeah.
And next week will be the final meeting of the Federal Reserve's Open Market Committee.
The working man's Fed.
Yes, we'll wind up this year's series on monetary policy, which is obviously the most exciting content that we have here on.
I'm already excited.
I'm sure. And I think that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz will officially call for the no confidence vote that will kick off the German election season, which will unfold in the next few months. So there'll be a lot to keep an eye on for next week's pulse-pounding episode of Working for Crusoe.
Right. He's Sam. I'm John. Have a great weekend. So long.
Thanks, everybody.